and science would satisfy where the aesthetic did not. The young man who found education in beer halls and operas and the accidental, as he aged, sometimes lost track of his own discovery and planned his efforts, constantly exploring, hoping to find education rather than let education happen, let it emerge as it might. So he moves predictably from the aesthetic to the mathematical, hoping for clarity, certainty, solutions. Quote, taking for granted that the alternative to art is arithmetic. Bad readers will constantly mistake, often willfully mistake, the character's experience and attitudes for Adams's, just as they insist, now really it's stupid to insist on this, that the education is an autobiography. Cronenberger, for example, this again in 39, carries on a tradition that reads the education as an autobiography of a prosaic and narrow intellectual ambition to education. This is Cronenberger. Adams self-consciously sought to channel his experiences and to convert them into education. As a result, his work was never much more than dilettantism. Now, such evident common sense claims are inevitably misprisions. In this scene, Henry is a figure of normal intellectual and social life among a certain class of people in the US. Independently wealthy, he travels, indulges, exoticizes, consumes, and like his character, Madeline Lee in his novel Democracy, he lives an effete intellectual and sociopolitically irresponsible, unimaginative life. But of course it's written about that. As important, such a type as Henry comes to be an all, as important as this, such a type as Henry comes to be an all too familiar sort of intellectual, precisely the prophet of doom and decline that Norman Podhoretz, ideologically and technically incapable of reading, believes Adams himself to be. More important, Henry, the character, is a mockery of the emergent type in Europe and America, and this, I'm afraid, is more controversial, of those intellectuals such as Walter Benjamin and Edmund Husserl, who in their profoundly different ways build massive intellectual projects on the belief and experience of ruination. What does Henry conclude when he discovers that math provides no better answers than art? I quote, nothing came out as it should. Anyone could set up or pull down a society. One could frame no sort of satisfactory answer to the constructive doctrines of Adam Smith or the destructive criticisms of Karl Marx. For a character such as this, the unthought affective response to these failures in planned learning, understanding, and direction, the failures in normal and directed education, the response is simple but horrifying, and I quote again, one reveled at will in the ruin of every society in the past and rejoiced in proving the prospective overthrow of every society that seemed possible in the future. But meanwhile, these societies, which violated every law, moral, arithmetical, and economical, not only propagated each other, but produced also fresh complexities with every propagation and developed mass with every complexity. End of quote. Adams, in other words, knows the psychological allure, the melancholic desire of the self-justified and self-justifying apocalyptic intellectual. Note carefully that the apocalyptic imagination is indulgent, lacks empathy, and is smug. In his late work, called in English On the Concept of History, and now I'm going to quote probably the most famous image in modern Western literary theory, Walter Benjamin epitomizes the stance of the apocalyptic intellectual in relation to history, producing the 20th century's most influential European image of accumulated ruin. This is familiar with it. Referring to painting things. This is how the angel of history must look. His face is turned toward the past, where a chain of events appears before us. He sees one single catastrophe, which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it at his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise and has got caught in his wings. It is so strong that the angel can no longer close them. This storm drives him irresistibly into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows toward the sky. That's the Angelus Novus explication. End of quote. Now, this glorious image, starting point for powerful reflection on history and capital especially, enables a vast critical enterprise that expresses contempt for history as a domain of domination and licenses a corresponding intellectual judgment that ruins all achievement as always already fallen. This occurs within the processes, not just of apocalyptic messianism, but also the critical technologies of allegorization, as we know from studying Benjamin on Baudelaire in particular. Indeed, enterprise and judgment sustain themselves by reveling in an attitude that makes history worse than worthless as an imaginative and human domain. As a student, Henry Adams was once a catastrophist, a follower of Louis Agassiz at Harvard in a reaction against Darwin and evolution. Benjamin says that the historical process of ruination that blows back the angel's wings is progress. That's his word. Like the comic Henry, who has to learn that there is no progress, no direction to history, no amelioration within its forms and formations, Benjamin, tragically, melodramatically, revels nihilistically in a seeming human fate whose logic he sees as demanding or affording only destructive discontinuity, rupture, as the permanent basis of his anti-historical allegory. Of course, I've repeated there Paul Deman's definition of irony. As Adams learned to leave Agassiz and other catastrophists behind, he learned to love Darwin and evolution. He learned to live in and imagine life for historical processes that offer no guarantee of perfection, but demand responsibilities for willful human action. Erasing God and the residues of God discourse from his imagination and writing, knowing that evolution embeds the human organism within the erratic and uncertain processes of selection, Adams realistically draws his mind and imagination to human responsibility for the future and to the need for critical judgment of human action. This historicist approach is more nuanced, more difficult, and more loving than the easy, unfair word, than the ecstasies of esoteric nihilism or militarist ambition. All of Adams's attention is on the human, on action and will. Henry needs to learn to attend, and Adams shows us how he turns to human history, albeit after reveling in ruination. Quote, "Nothing had so confused the student as the conduct of mankind in the fin du siècle." End quote. Random education leads to hard but necessary judgments, the aim of which is not the Arnoldian loosening of categories, but rather the application of severe insight into the consequences of categories made too loose. Adams again. No one seemed very much concerned about this world or the future, unless it might be the anarchists. End of quote. Adams's task all along, since he announced this education as a book meant to form or cultivate the young, in his frame, young men in particular, for Mont Saint-Michel's, for young women, had been to reveal the necessity for judgment of human historical action from within the full historicality of subjectivity capable of particularized, non-esoteric historicist judgments. I'm not going to quote because there's no time. Podhoretz, Crystal, Wolfowitz, and their predecessors, Mahan, Roosevelt, and Henry Cabot Lodge, for instance, could not be the same mind as Henry. Servants of the state, they wanted to direct to their own visionary ends. They saw nothing wrong with war or massacres, insistent that education, if you prefer here, that Bildung, that formation, should only serve their purposes, the purposes of great power, organized as the counterpoise to the nihilism of Benjamin's angel. They too hate the history they claim to embody and destroy the historical human species that might live its life without the crimes of their nihilism. The proper counterpoise to both nihilisms follows from this remark, I'm drawing now to an end, from this remark in the education. Quote, "The woman who is known only through a man is known wrong." End quote. Neocons and Benjaminians alike have no place for women in their stories of desire and allure. Therefore, they turn away from history, wherein, as Adams mockingly reminds his male readers, they may find women. Were there sufficient time, we would trace Adams' staging of Henry's discovery of women to the conclusion that through, quote, "women's eyes, the old problems become new and personal," end quote. The effect, he writes, was to expel, and I quote again, to expel archaic law and antiquarianism once and for all. What comes, he says, is, and I quote again, a new sense of history. So Podhoretz tries to mock Blackmer's claim that something had to be wrong with the US because it did not provide a political space of free play for intelligence such as Adams. We see, to the contrary, that the US could be such a space, but that its openness requires the imaginative practice that learns from the hidden openness, the chances of historical time and being, and in turn that keeps that space open. Podhoretz et al. Practice imagination, but not with responsibility to throw off the greedy and archaic, not just to support the primitive and cumulative impulses of the market and the state, but, more important for our purposes, to preempt the possibilities of poesis that reside in the erotic discovery of women outside the assertive ignorance of male nihilisms. Esoteric truth revels in nihilism, erasing history as it erases women, substitutes the abrupt, explosive discontinuities of catastrophe for the embedded reproduction of selection that allows historically human beings to emerge without a desperate fear of life and time. Erotic knowing, the formation that opens the field of free play, depends on and allows critical judgment, creating subjects not swarmed by the dogmas and powers of state and market, superseding the allure of empire and commodity alike. The essential vision of the neocons is anti-historicist nihilism. It is a disease of the age, so to speak, in Adams, perhaps with Foucault. And here I say Pache Richard Rorty, whose American apologetics thought the alignment of Adams and Foucault to be an unnatural liaison. It is a disease, and Adams lets us speak about it in a way that embraces the judgment, the anger, and the clear-cut condemnation. Moreover, it does it in a learned embrace. The education never mentions his dead wife Clover. Yet always and everywhere, women and sexuality saturate the education as the wisdom of evolution, of the species, of effort, of action, of openness, of emergence. All these against the war-mongering, archaic impulses that ruin life and murder peoples. Poetic formation is all. Properly done, there is nothing outside it. The species is not first political or rational, but poetic. To think otherwise, to embrace ruin and ruination, is a nihilism aimed not at man, in quotations, as in many anti-humanisms, but at the human. A nihilism against love, creativity, possibility, and the species, and of course, therefore, historicality itself. Self-exterminist, such nihilism aims to weaken the imagination, putting in its place the finality of apocalypse, falsely offered as inevitable and redemptive. Against the neocons, then, one might say, an end to great power. Promise instead great poems. Thank you. Sorry.
No, is there time for questions? 10 minutes for questions?
Please.
Could you comment on what appears to be the anti-intellectual bias of the American people vis-a-vis your topic?
Not too easily. I mean, despite everything here, I'm actually a literary critic. So, or because of everything. It is, of course, part of the argument of this paper that on the question of education, at least as expressed in text, the project of the American state in the last decade has been to seriously damage the possibilities of public education, and has rather cynically, as Irving Kristol makes clear in his son's magazine. What is that called?
The Weekly Standard.
The Weekly Standard. As Irving Kristol makes clear, the neoconservative project requires an alignment